Olá a todos e todas, sejam muito bem-vindos. É com muita alegria que hoje nós recebemos a autora Lucy Delap para falar sobre o novo livro dela, Feminismos, uma história global. Lucy Delap é historiadora especializada em Grã-Bretanha moderna, história de gênero e do feminismo. Atualmente leciona na Universidade de Cambridge e é fellow do Murray Edwards College. Seu livro The Feminist Avant-Garde ganhou o Women's History Network Prize em 2008 e sua pesquisa recebeu o Royal Historical Society Public History Prize. É com muita alegria que nós recebemos Lucy aqui hoje.
I think that the waves metaphor has been really problematic for the history of feminism. It's made us look at particular moments and it's taken our attention away from the periods in between. It's not very easy to make those waves work when we think globally. For example, that period that we sometimes call the first wave, when women were asking for the vote, for entry into kind of liberal democratic systems. That doesn't work at all when we look at women's demands in the kind of the early 20th century Japan, for example, where they're asking for quite different things, where they're looking for bodily autonomy and sexual freedoms, and the right to vote is not a very prominent part of that movement. It doesn't work for lots of parts of Europe where women come to vote at very, very different points, right up until the 1970s in Switzerland. So I think that metaphor, it doesn't work for global history. And it also makes us think that when women were making demands, feminist demands, they were all asking for the same thing. We get that sense in a wave of everyone is going in the same direction. The wave is all pointing in the same way. Whereas actually, if we write a critical feminist history, we need to stay aware of the differences that there were within feminist movements, that women did not agree, that perhaps working class women really didn't have the same kinds of demands that bourgeois women had, for example, or middle class women, that white women were asking for different things and seeing the world very differently from Black women and Asian women and women of refugee status. So we need to try to capture these divergences within the women's movement and not try to pretend that women are always united in their demands. So my book is organized around big themes that let us travel around the world in a much more exciting and exploratory way. For example, I've written, the book is organized around ideas of dreams. What dreams do women have? And I start out with juxtaposing 3 different sites of dreams, starting in colonial India, in Bengal, with Rokeya Hussain and her vision of what a female-dominated future might look like, which is published just around the same time as Alexandra Kollontai is writing about her dreams of a future, which are communist dreams, which are informing her experiences in those kind of very early days of the Bolshevik Revolution. And that's set alongside Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's based in the United States and is writing about, again, a different kind of feminist vision. So I put all those dreams together to show that women want different things, but they're all thinking big at this moment. And this is a moment where feminism is a global conversation, if you like, that could span, an Islamic, a communist, or a liberal vision of what change might mean for the feminist movement. I also write about the way in which thinking about feminist spaces might organize the book, to think about different kinds of spaces that are claimed by women, that are created by feminists, and to think also about the policing of those spaces and the obstacles that women experience when we think, for example, about the kinds of the consciousness raising spaces of the 1970s, or the anti-colonial organizing, which is common in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Those are very different kinds of spaces. So space gives us this exciting way in to think about feminist history. To be honest, I don't think you can write feminist history of the globe and keep up a strict chronology. It just would be impossible. So instead, I think it's fresh and exciting for us to travel around these themes themes about emotions, themes about activism, themes about thinking about different kinds of cultural creativity. Like, for example, there's a chapter on feminist music and song. So getting us to not only read about feminism, but to try to hear feminism and to think about the arts in this story of feminist politics. The vote is very well known in feminist history, but if we go global, we find that women are just as interested in struggles around literacy, around land rights, around access to water, around securing all sorts of property rights. And these are campaigns that are very important in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and are really shaped by the contextual politics of the period. So, for example, whether one is in a colonized space or in a post-colonial society or in a newly nationalist society or a society that's at war. And so we get a really different range of stories by going beyond the vote. One of the stories that I love is the activism of Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who was a Nigerian activist who started out quite a kind of conventional philanthropist as a educated, relatively middle upper class woman trying to sort of help poorer women in Nigeria. But she went on a personal journey, which was to recognize the needs of working class women. Particularly, she was interested in market women who were market traders in Nigeria in the 1940s. And she decided to really throw off a lot of her sort of philanthropic assumptions about what women needed, and instead to organize these very innovative, what she called picnics, which was a space at which women could make demands and could enjoy themselves, could basically go on strike, but they called it a picnic so that they didn't get harassed by the police. And that proves a really kind of productive, creative space where women start to make demands, for example, to be free of taxation, particularly the kind of degrading taxation of the occupying British colonial authorities, where women had to prove their age by stripping naked. And this was an insulting, degrading practice. So it was a degrading practice that was both a practice aimed at women specifically, but also part of a colonial struggle that in the end sees women playing an important part in helping to make demands for Nigerian independence. And Funmilayo Ransome Kuti was really always aware of how women were both lacking in power in Nigerian traditional societies where they were, objectified as women, but also drawing on sources of power from their traditional roles to articulate their anti-colonial resistance. And she just emerges as a brilliant example of how we need to go beyond our usual characters in feminist history and recognize women who were organized under different names and who, had a very different kind of politics from the suffrage era politics. And we get a very different kind of feminist history from looking at them. That goal of trying to span half of humanity is very much a kind of rhetorical utopian goal. And I think that the women's movement has sometimes been too self-critical in discovering that it's impossible to get to that point. And I do think it's impossible. I don't think it's ever likely that women are all going to sign up to the same political demands. They are very different, and they always have different ways of seeing the world and different ways of imagining their futures. So I think the women's movement needs to hope for coalition building and strategic alliances between women, rather than thinking that it's ever possible to unite women. So we shouldn't be angry with ourselves that we can't unite all women. Rather, we should ask, what kind of conversation can feminism be between women who have different kinds of expectations and hopes, whether that's organized around class or ethnicity or sexuality, or their experiences of labor markets or disability. And often we can find areas where we do agree. Even if we may profoundly disagree on some aspects, we might well find campaigns or goals that unite us. For example, we may not agree on this trans question of exactly what a woman is, whether a woman has to be biologically female or whether gender is a much more fluid experience than that. We might not be able to get agreement on that today, but I think we can agree that that all should be protected against kind of the endemic violence that women are facing, whether they are biologically born female or whether they are assigned male at birth and then become women later. We can agree that nobody should be subject to the kind of femicide that we see in contemporary societies. So then we can find common ground and shared campaigns. So let's not set up to be universalist. Let's set up to be pragmatic and to find what unites us rather than get paralyzed by what divides us. We can't hide the fact that these goals sometimes are actually diametrically opposed. And this we learn from studying for example, the problems of racism in the feminist movement, which has long been a movement where white women's experience has dominated the kind of the political agenda. And it has been quite hard for white women to understand the intersectional racialization that women of color have long understood. So I think that we need to recognize that we might have these historic legacies of racism and homophobia and forms of exclusion. And in understanding that and understanding that kind of history, we can then start writing a different kind of history, right? A different history that acknowledges those divergences, but understands that we can also, by acknowledging them, move on and not be paralyzed by those historic differences. So what can we learn from different women's demands? Well, I was super interested in my historical research to discover that the first feminist magazine in both Britain and in Japan was one that was interested in the idea of the kind of the highest evolution of woman. The feminists of that period were looking at Nietzsche and his idea of the Superman and came up with their account of this, which was about the superwoman. Now, this doesn't really resonate with our feminist language today. We're no longer really looking for a vision of the superwoman, but that demand was really powerful amongst both the Free Woman Journal in the United Kingdom and the Saito Blue Stocking Journal in Japan. They were avant-garde feminists who were not asking for the vote, but were asking for a whole different lifestyle, for women to have like personal autonomy and decision-making and to live new kinds of lives. So that moment where Japan and Britain are kind of sharing a feminist vision is such a fascinating way of juxtaposing two very different societies, but realizing that, in fact, they can be asking for very similar things at any one given moment. Sometimes feminists have been divided by the prejudice that is common historically, if we think about how the world has been divided around people who have power and people who don't have power. I don't think the women's movement is ever going to be a space which is free of those power dynamics, but I do think it's a space where we can be more reflexive, more imaginative about thinking about how power is exercised. So we can't ever hope that we'll get beyond it, but I do think that we can understand the kind of the large structures that are typically around citizenship status, around sexuality, around race and ethnicity, around religion. Religion, for example, is a particularly prominent way of thinking about gender difference. And that means that there's been a long history of association between certain religions and the oppression of women, between Sikh or Hindu or Muslim religions and the idea of women's oppression. That means that it's been very difficult for women from other faiths to imagine building feminist coalitions across those religious divides. And I think that will carry on. It's a site of power and division. But the kinds of histories that I want to write are ones where we understand how that has been experienced in the past. And that helps us to avoid the exclusion, the inability to listen to different women's needs. I'm very confident that as we continue to do research in feminist history and feminist studies, that we come to understand better the different ways in which gender has been a site of disadvantage and a site of struggle and a site of hopes and new visions. I found it particularly difficult to access stories from sub-Saharan Africa, where I think a lot of the questions around gender have not been framed as feminist questions, where women who are activists have not always wanted to identify as feminists. And that is something that we need to understand and historicize, to understand why feminism might not have been the preferred language of women in certain kinds of struggles, and why instead they might have preferred the language, let's say, of Pan-Africanism, or the language of socialism, or communism, or the language of womanism. So we can understand why they haven't wanted that language, but writing that history is also feminist history, right? We're understanding the kinds of exclusions and silences that we might find in feminist history. So I'm not trying to say all these women really are feminists if only they knew, what feminism was. I'm saying that our feminist history has to be cognizant of the kinds of gaps and silences that there have been in feminist history. But I do also remain confident that if we look closely in the archives, in the print culture, in the novels, in the creative arts across the world, we always find struggle and contest over gender inequality. It just looks very different in different places. One of my students gave me a beautiful embroidery that said, "Smash the patriarchy." And I was very taken with it. It's up on my wall at work. And I felt it was important to include objects because there's been such exciting histories written about material culture. And if you like, the whole book is about new ways that historians work. So looking at emotions, looking at material culture, looking at spaces and places, looking at dreams. These are all kind of new ways in that go away from the traditional political history or the traditional intellectual history and give us kind of exciting new ways to do feminist history. So objects helps us to get beyond sort of canonical intellectuals in feminist history. Those people like Olympe de Gouges or Mary Wollstonecraft, that's commonly the place that people start when they want to talk about feminist history. But in starting with Olympe de Gouges or Mary Wollstonecraft, we always start in Europe, and we always start with ideas. So if we start with objects, we might go to very different places. So one object that I enjoyed writing about was the speculum, the object that was invented under very hostile conditions by medical doctors in the United States who were experimenting without their consent on African American slaves. So that is an object that has a very dark history and speaks to the long-standing experience of racism in the United States. But it's also an object that was taken out of that context and reclaimed by the women's health movement in arguing that women could take control of their own medical technologies, could have a relationship to their own bodies, could discover their own genitalia, could see inside their body, and bring a feminist gaze to their vagina, to their genitals. And so the speculum was reinvented not as a cold metal instrument of discomfort for women, but was remade in plastic as a cheap, warm, accessible object, which could give women a new relationship to their bodies. That's just one object amongst many, but I think it's a particularly interesting one, and it speaks to the global health movement that was one of the most important vectors for feminist interactions around women's relationship to their bodies. I really enjoyed exploring the kind of the plethora of feminist spaces that were invented, whether they were radical spaces of barricades and conferences and workshops and health groups, or whether they were semi-commercial spaces like the wonderful radical feminist bookshops. I do think that one of the most important spaces has been the space of print culture, and that a lot of the feminist histories that I look at revolves around the production of books and magazines and poetry. And so print culture has been absolutely central to feminist organizing. I used to think that the digital realm was just a kind of like another phase in this kind of creative realm where women could set up websites and make connections, and as we've learned in the pandemic, to be able to have conversations digitally like this one that we're having. But I don't think we can regard the digital realm as an undifferentiated realm. I do think that a lot of the interactions that we have in the digital realm have been placed on platforms where the algorithms that govern them and the commercialization of those platforms, I'm thinking here of social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and so on, have made those spaces not so easily accessible to women, or if they are bringing feminist conversations to those spaces, they're finding them to be very hostile. The algorithms amplify voices that are melodramatic and sensationalist, and I would say are systematically biased against feminist perspectives, and so are not easily usable for feminist purposes. So part of me thinks we must go back and rediscover some of those physical spaces, some of those face-to-face interactions, which built the infrastructure of the women's movement and created strong emotions of love and solidarity and sexual desire, and a whole variety of emotions were felt in those interactions. And I think that not only is the digital space at risk of being dominated by extremist voices, but it also flattens out our emotions. So it's much harder for a kind of vivid and living connection to the feminist agenda. So it's notable that in the recent struggles over abortion rights and femicide, there's been a very strong emphasis on creative actions that involve actual physical presence, right? Dancing on the steps of parliaments, singing, marching, coming together in creative ways to vote and to resist the rise of the kind of authoritarian right. And therefore, I think I've become more convinced that there is a kind of political activism that is very hard to do in digital spaces, and that we need to become more grassroots as a feminist movement. It's been very sobering to see the rise of so many populist politicians who use an anti-feminist agenda as a cheap way of differentiating themselves from others. Sometimes that anti-feminist agenda is also couched in racist terms. Sometimes it's, if you like, femo-nationalist, in that it's pro-feminist, but uses homophobic or religious forms of exclusion to create forms of feminism that I don't recognize as being part of the feminist movement. So there's a complicated landscape there, where feminism has become a kind of political football for lots of these authoritarian regimes. And they have found a worrying degree of popular support. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that there has equally been a resurgence of feminist activism, the green wave that is sweeping Latin America and is an inspiration to the rest of the world, the resistance that women in Poland and Ireland have mounted to try to decriminalize abortion or to defend their abortion rights, and the very high profile that the activism against violence against women is currently seeing in Australia, in Pakistan, in India, in the United Kingdom, in the US, in Mexico. This is a very exciting moment, actually. So why has there been such a populist global movement? It's because of a more multilateral world, a more unstable world, where people are looking for new political scripts, as we, if you like, see the kind of failure of both liberalism and capitalism to create, stable societies, as we move into a period of climate emergency, and all around the world, societies are becoming more unequal, and the sort of rapacious nature of a poorly regulated capitalism is damaging all of our political institutions. So it's no surprise that a more unequal society sees a more extremist politics, and perhaps it's no surprise that feminism is targeted in that environment. And social media has played no small part there in amplifying anti-feminist voices and amplifying hatred expressed against women and against feminism. But I still remain hopeful that just as so far as we see a authoritarian turn, we also see a resistant feminist movement that is successfully fighting back, and is seeing in Chile, in Argentina, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, is seeing resistance campaigns, and I hope in Brazil as well, to speak a different kind of truth to power. There was a very strong feeling in the women's movements of the 1970s that the language of feminism was intended for women only. That was because they were fed up with particularly men on the left who thought that feminism was just like another political movement that they could co-opt. And so I think it was really necessary at that point that women's organizing experimented with spaces where men were not around, with the space needed to develop intimate politics around bodies and sexual history and experiences of violence and so on. That was a very powerful moment for women's movements all around the world. But it was also a moment where men were deeply invested and interested in what feminism might mean for them. And it remains important, and has historically been important, that men feel that they are also damaged by patriarchy. And women often live their lives in intimate contact with men who are our fathers, our lovers, our sons, our brothers. And it doesn't seem to me possible that we can have a feminist future if we don't make men part of that movement for change. I think that in my book, I look at a whole variety of success stories for where it has been possible for men to be allies or even to be part of the feminist movement. And it is really clear that men are the beneficiaries of, for example, opportunities to be more active parents, or opportunities to be able to trust other men and become emotionally intimate with other men, to address their homophobia and to stop being terrified of other men's bodies and other men's emotions. So men can be the beneficiaries of feminist activism. Historically, it hasn't always been very easy to negotiate those relationships. But I think there has been, for example, in 2017, the global Women's March that saw such a visible articulation of feminist passion. Men were marching too, and men like the high-profile US President Barack Obama were not scared to declare themselves to be feminists. So I would say it's characteristic of the 21st century that men are more willing to declare themselves to be feminists, to try to push back against toxic forms of masculinity, like the supporters of Donald Trump, for example, and Jair Bolsonaro, and to see that there are benefits to them from a more gender equal society and more empowerment of women. International Women's Day was an invention of the socialist movement, the socialist and labor movement, and was celebrated across a range of countries where socialist campaigning was very powerful in the early 20th century. And it proved to be an incredibly vividly experienced part of the ritual calendar of socialism, if you like. But it was also, I think, sometimes taken over by other kinds of feminist movements and used for new purposes. And it was sometimes co-opted by the state. So particularly in communist or Soviet bloc countries, it could become a very predictable, formulaic part of the celebrations of women's equality in those countries. And so, in a way, for me, the more exciting parts of International Women's Day is where it is genuinely a part of the women's movement and not just a sort of a state-led celebration. So I think it's been sometimes associated with very radical actions, like, for example, the strikes by Icelandic women, recognizing that women were significantly lower paid than men and refusing to work on a day of protest that saw almost all Icelandic women stop their childcare and stop their housework and stop their paid employment and down their tools. So sometimes it's been used in these incredibly vivid ways to dramatize particular feminist campaigns. I think that it's really important that feminists today don't turn their back on history. There's a sort of funny dynamic of both a fascination with foremothers, but also a frustration amongst today's campaigners that women in the past have seemed to have different principles, have seemed to be too racist or too bourgeois or too white to really, give a kind of a meaningful feminist history. And so in writing a global feminist history, I've been trying to help us construct a history that really can speak to our concerns today by foregrounding the leadership of working class women and women of color, anti-colonial activists, to show how vividly useful feminist history is of the past. I've also wanted to write histories that don't try to sweep under the carpet the conflicts of the past, so that we normalize the idea that women are in conflict, that women don't share the same goals, but that they can nonetheless still come together in feminist campaigns, even if they don't always agree. So I think it's important that we have this history of feminism that doesn't just glorify the past, but acknowledges that it's been difficult to try to create activist momentum behind feminist goals in the past.